Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to helping people, but her path to nursing hadn't been conventional. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that colleagues noticed, but couldn't quite place. There was something different about the way she moved through the hospital corridors, purposeful, alert, always scanning her surroundings even during routine tasks. The pediatric ward at St. Mary's General Hospital had become her second home over the past 18 months. Children responded to her naturally, perhaps sensing the genuine warmth beneath her professional demeanor. She had a gift for making the youngest patients smile even during their most difficult moments, and parents often requested her specifically when their children needed care. What none of them knew was that before Sarah became a registered nurse, she had spent 8 years as an Army Ranger. The transition from military service to healthcare had been challenging, but it felt like a natural evolution of her desire to serve others. The skills she'd learned in the Rangers, situational awareness, quick decision-making under pressure, and the ability to remain calm in crisis situations, served her well in the fast-paced hospital environment. Sarah had joined the military straight out of high school, driven by a sense of duty and adventure. The Ranger training had been grueling, pushing her physical and mental limits beyond what she thought possible. She'd served 3 tours overseas, earning commendations for her leadership and tactical skills. But after losing several close friends in combat, she'd made the difficult decision to leave the military and pursue a career in healing rather than warfare. The nursing program had been a different kind of challenge. While her military discipline helped her excel academically, learning to show vulnerability and emotional openness required significant adjustment. Her instructors noticed her exceptional composure during emergency situations, but attributed it to natural talent rather than years of specialized training. At St. Mary's, Sarah worked the night shift by choice. She preferred the quieter hours, when she could focus more intently on her patients without the constant bustle of daytime activities. The night shift also meant fewer administrators and visitors, creating an environment where she felt more comfortable. Her military background had made her naturally vigilant during nighttime hours, and she found herself naturally suited to the responsibility of watching over vulnerable patients when the hospital was at its most vulnerable. Her colleagues appreciated her reliability and competence, though some found her intensity slightly intimidating. Sarah rarely talked about her personal life or background, deflecting personal questions with gentle humor or by redirecting conversations toward work-related topics. She'd learned in the military that operational security was important, and old habits died hard. Dr. Jennifer Chun, the head of pediatrics, had quickly recognized Sarah's exceptional abilities. During medical emergencies, Sarah seemed to anticipate needs before they were voiced, appeared with necessary equipment before being asked, and maintained perfect composure while others showed stress. Dr. Chun had tried to convince Sarah to pursue advanced nursing degrees or specialized training, but Sarah seemed content in her current role. The pediatric ward housed children ranging from infants to teenagers, dealing with everything from routine surgeries to serious chronic conditions. Sarah had developed relationships with many of the long-term patients and their families. There was 8-year-old Tommy, recovering from leukemia treatments, who always asked Sarah to tell him stories about adventures, though she carefully edited her military experiences into tales of hiking and camping. 12-year-old Maria, dealing with complications from diabetes, had confided in Sarah about her fears and dreams for the future. Sarah's apartment, a modest one-bedroom place 15 minutes from the hospital, reflected her minimalist military background. The walls were nearly bare except for a few photographs of her nursing school graduation and her parents. She maintained excellent physical condition, running every morning before work and practicing martial arts on her days off. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet, polite woman who kept to herself, but was always willing to help with emergencies. The decision to keep her military background private hadn't been difficult. Sarah had seen how people sometimes reacted when they learned about her Ranger service, either with uncomfortable hero worship or with assumptions about violence and aggression that didn't reflect who she was. In the hospital setting, she wanted to be known for her nursing skills and compassion, not her ability to handle weapons or navigate combat situations. Her supervisor, Margaret Walsh, had been initially skeptical of Sarah's quiet intensity but had come to rely on her completely. Margaret often scheduled Sarah for the most challenging nights, knowing she could handle whatever came up. There had been several incidents: a patient experiencing sudden cardiac arrest, a confused elderly man who became violent, a fire alarm that required quick evacuation procedures, where Sarah's calm leadership had been invaluable. Sarah's military training manifested in subtle ways that most people didn't notice. She automatically noted the locations of exits and emergency equipment in any room she entered. She maintained awareness of everyone around her, tracking movements and changes in behavior patterns. Her posture and movement reflected years of physical conditioning and tactical training, though she'd learned to soften these characteristics in civilian settings. The night shift team had become like family to her. There was Marcus, the security guard who took his job seriously but relied heavily on Sarah's judgment during unusual situations. Janet, the senior nurse who'd been working nights for 20 years and had endless stories about hospital life. Dr. Rodriguez, the overnight attending physician who appreciated Sarah's clinical insights and her ability to handle complex situations independently. What none of them realized was that Sarah's hypervigilance wasn't just professional diligence. It was ingrained survival instinct from years of operating in hostile environments. She noticed details others missed: the way someone walked, changes in voice patterns, anything that seemed out of place or potentially threatening. In the hospital setting, this translated into exceptional patient care and early recognition of developing problems. Sarah's parents, both retired teachers, worried that she was too isolated and focused on work. They understood her desire to serve others, but wished she would open up more about her experiences and build closer relationships. Sarah loved them deeply but found it difficult to explain how fundamentally her military service had changed her worldview and comfort levels with different types of relationships. The training that had once been focused on neutralizing threats and completing missions had evolved into something more subtle but equally important. Sarah approached her nursing duties with the same meticulous attention to detail and commitment to excellence that had made her an outstanding ranger. Every patient became a mission, not to be conquered, but to be protected and healed. Her colleagues often marveled at her ability to remain calm during chaotic situations, not knowing that she'd been trained to function effectively under far more extreme pressure. A child's medical emergency was serious and stressful, but it didn't compare to making life or death decisions while under enemy fire. This perspective allowed Sarah to bring a steady presence to situations where others might panic. The pediatric ward itself had become familiar territory to Sarah, as thoroughly mapped in her mind as any military objective she'd once studied. She knew every room, every corridor, every entrance and exit. She understood the hospital's security procedures and emergency protocols better than most staff members, having studied them with the same intensity she'd once applied to mission briefings. As autumn approached and Sarah settled into her routine at St. Mary's, she felt more at peace than she had since leaving the military. The work was meaningful, her skills were valued, and she was making a real difference in people's lives. She had no idea that all of her training, both military and medical, was about to be tested in ways she never could have anticipated. The night that would change everything was approaching, though Sarah couldn't know it yet. For now, she continued her quiet service, watching over the most vulnerable patients with skills forged in conflict, but dedicated to healing. The children in her care slept safely, protected by someone they saw simply as a caring nurse, unaware that their guardian had once been one of the military's elite warriors. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Sarah was conducting her usual rounds when she noticed a man in the hospital lobby who didn't belong. He wasn't visiting anyone. She could tell by his posture and movement patterns. He was surveying, studying the layout, timing security rotations. Her ranger instincts kicked in immediately, though she maintained her professional demeanor. Marcus, the night security guard, was a good man but lacked the training to recognize reconnaissance when he saw it. The stranger was well-dressed, appeared to be in his 40s, and carried himself with the confident air of someone who belonged. But Sarah noticed details others missed: the way his eyes systematically cataloged camera positions, the way he checked his watch against security patrol schedules, the way he tested door handles when he thought no one was watching. Sarah made mental notes without appearing to pay attention. The man had military bearing, possibly special forces background based on his movement and observation techniques. His clothing was expensive but practical. Good shoes for running, jacket that could conceal weapons, no jewelry or accessories that could create noise or catch on objects. This wasn't a casual visitor or confused family member. She didn't report her observations immediately. Years of intelligence gathering had taught her the value of collecting more information before raising alarms. False reports could damage credibility and make people less likely to listen when real threats emerged. Instead, Sarah began her own discreet investigation. Over the next several nights, the man returned. Each time, he spent approximately 30 minutes moving through different areas of the hospital, always with apparent legitimate purpose. He asked directions to various departments, inquired about visiting hours, and behaved exactly like someone unfamiliar with the hospital layout. But Sarah noticed he never actually visited any patients or met with any staff members for extended conversations. Sarah began documenting his visits, times, locations, behaviors, physical descriptions. She used skills learned in surveillance and counter-surveillance operations, observing without being noticed, tracking patterns without creating suspicion. The man was clearly intelligent and trained, but he didn't realize he was being watched by someone with comparable skills. On the fourth night of observation, Sarah noticed the man paying particular attention to the pediatric ward. He spent time near the elevators that provided access to the children's floor, studied the security desk positioning, and observed shift change procedures. Sarah's protective instincts intensified. Whatever this man was planning, it involved the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. The mystery deepened when Sarah ran a discreet background check using databases she still had limited access to through veteran networks. The man's description matched Marcus Wright, a former Navy SEAL who had been discharged under questionable circumstances 3 years earlier. The details were classified, but Sarah's contacts indicated the discharge involved allegations of excessive force and failure to follow orders during a civilian protection mission. Sarah faced a dilemma. Her suspicions were based on instinct and observation rather than concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Hospital administration might dismiss her concerns as paranoia from someone adjusting to civilian life. But her training told her that Wright's behavior represented a legitimate threat assessment scenario. She decided to begin implementing subtle security improvements without raising official alarms. Sarah started varying her patrol routes to increase her presence near potential vulnerability points. She began building relationships with the night cleaning crew, encouraging them to report anything unusual they might observe. She suggested to Dr. Rodriguez that they review emergency evacuation procedures for the pediatric ward, framing it as general preparedness rather than response to specific threats. Marcus, the security guard, noticed Sarah's increased vigilance, but attributed it to her natural diligence. Sarah began engaging him in conversations about security protocols, asking questions about response procedures and backup communication systems. She learned that the hospital's security measures were designed for typical healthcare facility issues, preventing theft, managing disruptive visitors, handling medical emergencies, not defending against trained assault. The hospital's physical security was adequate for normal situations, but would be insufficient against someone with Wright's background and training. The building had multiple access points, limited camera coverage in certain areas, and security staff who were trained for de-escalation rather than tactical response. Local police response time averaged 8 to 12 minutes, which could be an eternity during a crisis situation. Sarah began mentally preparing contingency plans. She identified potential defensive positions throughout the pediatric ward, located all emergency communication devices, and mapped the quickest evacuation routes for patients with different mobility levels. She started keeping a detailed mental roster of which children were in which rooms, their medical conditions, and their ability to move quickly if necessary. Dr. Chen noticed changes in Sarah's behavior, increased intensity, more frequent security-related questions, subtle modifications to patient care routines that prioritized quick access to exits. When questioned, Sarah explained her concerns in general terms, suggesting that the hospital should review security measures for vulnerable patient populations. Dr. Chen appreciated Sarah's diligence, but didn't grasp the urgency behind her recommendations. Wright's reconnaissance continued for 2 weeks, with visits becoming more focused and purposeful. Sarah observed him testing door locks, timing elevator responses, and studying staff schedules with increasing precision. On several occasions, she noticed him paying attention to specific patient rooms, though she couldn't determine his selection criteria. The breakthrough came when Sarah overheard Wright making a phone call in the hospital parking garage. Using skills learned in signals intelligence, she positioned herself to hear fragments of conversation without being detected. Wright mentioned the target, maximum impact, and minimal resistance. He referenced specific room numbers in the pediatric ward and discussed timing coordination with someone else. Sarah realized she was no longer dealing with theoretical threat assessment. Wright was planning an active operation that would endanger the children under her care. The fragments she'd overheard suggested he wasn't working alone and that whatever he planned would happen soon. The methodical reconnaissance was entering final preparation phases. That night, Sarah made careful preparations of her own. She contacted a former Ranger colleague who worked in federal law enforcement, providing Wright's description and behavioral observations without revealing her own military background. She requested expedited background information and any current intelligence about potential threats to healthcare facilities. The information that came back confirmed her worst fears. Wright had been linked to a domestic extremist group that targeted government facilities and soft targets they considered symbolic of federal authority. Hospitals, schools, and other institutions that received government funding were considered legitimate targets. Wright's psychological profile indicated increasing radicalization and potential for violence against innocent civilians. Sarah faced an impossible choice. If she revealed her military background and surveillance activities, she might face questions about why she hadn't reported suspicious activity earlier. If she remained silent, children could die. The responsible thing was to contact law enforcement immediately, but she knew that bureaucratic response times might not match the urgency of the developing situation. She decided on a middle course. Sarah would alert hospital security and administration about potential threats while beginning her own protective measures. She would frame her concerns as general security awareness rather than specific intelligence about Wright's activities. This would provide official notification while allowing her to maintain operational flexibility. The conversation with hospital administration was frustrating. Security Director James Morrison listened politely to Sarah's concerns but seemed skeptical about the level of threat she was describing. He agreed to increase security patrols and review emergency procedures, but stopped short of implementing the comprehensive security measures Sarah recommended. Dr. Chun was more receptive, particularly when Sarah emphasized potential threats to pediatric patients. She authorized Sarah to coordinate with security staff about evacuation procedures and approved additional staffing for the night shift. But she also encouraged Sarah to consider whether her military background might be making her overly cautious about situations that were probably benign. Sarah knew that time was running short. Wright's surveillance had become increasingly focused, and she'd noticed him coordinating with at least 2 other individuals who displayed similar tactical awareness. The team was conducting final preparations for an operation that would likely occur during the night shift when security was minimal and escape routes were clearer. 3 nights before Halloween, Sarah intercepted communications that confirmed her analysis. Wright's team was planning to assault the pediatric ward during the overnight hours, targeting specific patients whose families had connections to government or military personnel. The attack was designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing security response. Sarah spent that night making final preparations. She ensured that all emergency equipment was fully stocked and easily accessible. She reviewed evacuation routes with the night staff, framing it as routine emergency preparedness. She positioned herself to have clear sight lines to all approaches to the pediatric ward while maintaining her normal nursing duties. The children slept peacefully, unaware that their quiet night nurse was preparing to defend them with skills forged in the world's most dangerous places. Sarah moved through her rounds with practiced calm, checking on each patient while simultaneously conducting final security assessments. Halloween night was approaching, and Sarah knew it would bring more than just trick-or-treaters to St. Mary's Hospital. Everything she had learned as a ranger, everything she had practiced as a nurse, everything she believed about protecting innocent lives was about to be tested in ways she had hoped never to face again. Halloween night arrived with an unseasonable chill that made Sarah's skin prickle with anticipation. She'd arrived for her shift 30 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct a final security assessment of the pediatric ward. The decorations put up by the day's shift, paper pumpkins and friendly ghosts, seemed innocent enough, but Sarah found herself analyzing how they might provide concealment or distract from security surveillance. The ward was fuller than usual, with 23 children ranging in age from 6 months to 16 years. Little Emma Rodriguez was recovering from heart surgery, her tiny body connected to monitors that beeped steadily through the night. 14-year-old Jake Patterson was dealing with complications from a car accident, his leg in traction, but his spirits high. Tommy Chun was back for another round of chemotherapy, sleeping fitfully while his worried parents maintained their vigil nearby. Sarah moved through her initial rounds with heightened awareness, checking each patient while simultaneously noting sight lines, potential cover positions, and evacuation challenges. Room 314 housed 3-year-old Sophie Walsh, who would need to be carried if emergency evacuation became necessary. Room 318 contained 2 teenagers who could move independently but might panic under stress. Every detail mattered when planning defensive operations around noncombatants. Dr. Rodriguez was working his usual overnight shift, catching up on paperwork in his office near the main nurses' station. Janet was handling the West Wing, while Sarah covered the East Wing and Central areas. Marcus had increased his patrol frequency per Sarah's suggestions, though he remained unaware of the specific threat developing around them. At 11:47 p.m., Sarah noticed the first anomaly. The hospital's main elevator showed unusual activity patterns on her monitoring screen. Cars moving to floors without corresponding call buttons being pressed, doors opening and closing without passengers. Someone was testing the elevator systems, possibly jamming doors to prevent security response or patient evacuation. Sarah activated her personal communication device, a modified cell phone that could reach her former military contacts if standard hospital communication systems were compromised. She sent a coded message indicating imminent threat to civilian target and providing the hospital's address. Help would come, but probably not quickly enough to prevent initial contact. By midnight, Sarah had confirmed at least 3 individuals moving through the hospital using service corridors and maintenance areas that bypassed main security checkpoints. Their movement patterns indicated sophisticated knowledge of the building layout and security procedures. Wright had clearly shared detailed reconnaissance with his team. The attack began at 12:23 a.m. with a coordinated assault on the hospital's communication systems. Phone lines went dead, internet connections failed, and the main security monitoring station experienced what appeared to be technical difficulties. Emergency lighting flickered as someone interfered with the electrical systems. Within minutes, St. Mary's Hospital had been effectively isolated from outside communication and assistance. Sarah immediately implemented emergency protocols she developed without official authorization. She activated backup communication devices hidden throughout the pediatric ward, sent emergency signals to law enforcement using her personal equipment, and began moving patients away from vulnerable positions. Her military training took over as she transitioned from nurse to tactical leader. Marcus discovered the communication outage when he tried to radio the main security desk and received only static. He found Sarah near the nurse's station and reported the situation, unaware that she already knew far more than he did about what was happening. "Marcus, we need to implement lockdown procedures immediately," Sarah told him, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Something's wrong with the building systems, and we need to protect the patients until maintenance can fix the problems." Marcus nodded, trusting Sarah's judgment. He began securing doors and checking on staff members while Sarah coordinated patient protection measures. She moved the most vulnerable children to interior rooms with multiple exit routes, consolidated medical equipment for quick access, and positioned herself where she could observe all approaches to the ward. At 12:31 a.m., Wright and his team reached the pediatric floor. Sarah saw them emerge from the stairwell, 3 men in dark clothing, moving with military precision, carrying weapons that had no legitimate place in a hospital. Wright took point, with 2 associates flanking him. They moved like professionals, using hand signals and maintaining tactical spacing as they advanced toward the nurse's station. For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat operations. But this wasn't a battlefield where everyone was a combatant. This was a hospital filled with innocent children and dedicated medical staff who had never trained for warfare. Her mission wasn't to engage the enemy. It was to protect non-combatants until help arrived. Sarah stepped out from behind the nurse's station, placing herself between the attackers and the patient rooms. She appeared calm and professional, every inch the concerned nurse responding to unusual visitors. "Excuse me, gentlemen, visiting hours ended at 9 p.m., she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "I'll need to see identification if you're here on official business." Wright stopped, surprised by the direct confrontation. He'd expected to encounter minimal resistance from night shift medical staff. His intelligence hadn't accounted for someone who would step forward rather than retreat when faced with armed intruders. "We're here about a patient," Wright said, his hand moving toward his concealed weapon. "Room 314. Sarah knew that was Sophie's room. She also knew that Wright's team hadn't come to visit anyone. They were here to send a message through violence against innocent children. Everything about their positioning, their equipment, their behavior indicated hostile intent. "I'll need to verify that through proper channels," Sarah replied, taking a half step forward instead of backing down. "Hospital policy requires all visitors to check in with security and receive authorization from attending physicians." Wright's associates exchanged glances, recognizing that their element of surprise was compromised. The quiet nurse facing them wasn't responding with the fear and confusion they'd expected. Instead, she was asking questions, maintaining eye contact, and positioning herself tactically between them and their objectives. "Ma'am, you need to step aside," Wright said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "We have business here that doesn't concern you." Sarah's training kicked in completely. She recognized the tone, the body language, the tactical positioning that preceded violence. Wright was preparing to escalate the situation, and she had seconds to respond before innocent people got hurt. "I'm sorry, but I can't allow unauthorized access to patient care areas," Sarah said firmly. "If you have legitimate business here, we can contact the appropriate administrators in the morning." Wright drew his weapon. The moment stretched out like a freeze frame as Sarah's mind processed multiple variables simultaneously. Wright's gun was coming up toward her center mass. His associates were spreading out to flank her position. Behind her, vulnerable children slept in rooms that offered no protection against armed assault. Marcus was somewhere else in the building, unaware of the immediate threat. Help was minutes away at best. Sarah moved. Years of combat training compressed into microseconds as she launched herself sideways, using the nurse's station for cover while drawing Wright's fire away from patient areas. Her movement was so swift and unexpected that Wright's first shot went wide, striking the wall where she'd been standing instead of center mass. "Active shooter. Lock down. Protect the patients," Sarah shouted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders under fire. She heard doors slamming as night staff responded to her warning, securing children in interior rooms and away from windows. Dr. Rodriguez's voice came from his office, calling for emergency assistance on backup communication systems. Janet was moving patients in the West Wing to safer positions. Wright's team regrouped quickly, advancing on Sarah's position with professional coordination. But Sarah had advantages they hadn't expected. She knew every inch of the pediatric ward, had positioned emergency equipment strategically, and had been mentally rehearsing defensive scenarios for weeks. More importantly, she was fighting for the lives of innocent children, and that gave her a level of motivation that mercenaries could never match. The battle for the pediatric ward was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was ready to demonstrate why Army Rangers are considered among the world's elite warriors, even when they're wearing scrubs instead of combat uniforms. The firefight that erupted in the pediatric ward of St. Mary's Hospital was unlike anything the building had ever witnessed. Sarah moved through the familiar corridors with deadly precision, using her intimate knowledge of the layout to outmaneuver Wright's team while protecting the children under her care. Wright's second shot shattered the medicine cabinet where Sarah had been positioned, but she was already moving, using cover and concealment techniques that had kept her alive in far more hostile environments. She reached the emergency equipment closet and retrieved items that most people wouldn't consider weapons: fire extinguisher for obscuring vision, defibrillator paddles that could deliver debilitating electrical shocks, even surgical instruments that could serve defensive purposes. Marcus. Emergency Lockdown Protocol 7. Sarah called out, using a code she'd created weeks earlier in case standard procedures proved inadequate. Marcus might not understand the specifics, but he would secure all access points and keep additional threats from reaching the ward. Wright's team was professional but had made a crucial tactical error. They'd underestimated their opposition and failed to gather adequate intelligence about the night shift staff. Wright knew about security protocols, medical equipment, and building layouts, but he didn't know that the quiet nurse was a decorated combat veteran with specialized training in close-quarters combat. Sarah used the hospital environment to her advantage, creating obstacles and distractions that disrupted Wright's planned assault. She triggered fire suppression systems in strategic locations, creating noise and confusion while providing cover for her movements. Emergency lighting flickered as she manipulated electrical systems, using darkness to mask her position while her training allowed her to operate effectively without full visibility. The first casualty came when Wright's associate attempted to breach the door to room 314 where little Sophie was sleeping. Sarah emerged from concealment behind a medical cart and struck with precision born of years of hand-to-hand combat training. The man went down immediately, his weapon clattering across the floor as Sarah secured it and continued moving. Wright realized he was facing unexpected resistance and attempted to regain tactical control. Johnson, suppress the nurse. Williams, check the other rooms, he barked, falling back on military command structure. But Sarah had already anticipated their response patterns. She'd positioned herself to control the main corridor while maintaining sight lines to all patient rooms. Every movement Wright's team made had to come through positions where she held tactical advantage. Years of studying enemy tactics had taught her to think like her opponents, and she used that knowledge to stay one step ahead. Dr. Rodriguez had barricaded himself in his office and was using backup communication systems to coordinate with law enforcement. His medical training hadn't prepared him for combat operations, but he understood that Sarah was buying them time and protecting patients with skills that seemed to come from somewhere other than nursing school. Janet was proving equally resourceful, moving patients from the West Wing to more secure locations while maintaining communication with Sarah through hand signals. The night staff was working together like a military unit, following Sarah's leadership without question because her competence was obvious even if her background remained mysterious. Wright made his second critical error when he attempted to use patients as leverage. He moved toward room 318 where the two teenagers were hiding, apparently planning to force Sarah's surrender by threatening innocent lives. It was exactly the wrong strategy to use against someone whose entire military career had been dedicated to protecting noncombatants. Sarah intercepted Wright before he reached the patient room, engaging him in close combat that revealed the full extent of her training. Wright was skilled, but Sarah had advantages beyond pure fighting ability. She was defending her territory, protecting people she cared about, and fighting for principles that had guided her entire adult life. The hand-to-hand combat was swift and decisive. Wright's military training was evident, but Sarah's was superior, honed by years of specialized operations and maintained through continued practice. More importantly, she was fighting with the desperate intensity of someone protecting innocent children, while Wright was pursuing an ideological agenda that provided less personal motivation. Within minutes, Wright was on the ground, disarmed and immobilized by techniques he didn't recognize but couldn't counter. Sarah secured his weapon and positioned herself to control his remaining associate, who suddenly found himself outnumbered and facing an opponent who had systematically dismantled his team's tactical advantages. Williams, put your weapon down and get on the ground, Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. This is over. Don't make it worse for yourself. Williams hesitated, perhaps recognizing that the quiet nurse had somehow become the tactical leader in a situation that had spiraled completely out of his team's control. Sarah's positioning gave her clear shots at his center mass, while he had no clean angles of attack. His training told him the mission was compromised and extraction was the priority, but his pride resisted surrender to a hospital worker. The decision was made for him when Marcus arrived with backup security personnel and local police who had finally restored communication systems and responded to emergency calls. Williams found himself surrounded by armed officers while Sarah maintained her defensive position between the attackers and the children they'd come to harm. The aftermath was chaotic as law enforcement secured the scene, medical personnel checked on shaken patients and staff, and hospital administrators tried to understand what had happened in their pediatric ward. Sarah found herself at the center of attention in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable, answering questions about events that had revealed capabilities she'd hoped to keep private. Detective Lisa Thompson, the lead investigator, reviewed Sarah's actions with professional admiration. "Ms. Martinez, your response to this situation was exceptional. Can you explain where you learned tactical procedures that seem well beyond typical nursing training?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that her military background would soon become public knowledge. "I served in the Army before becoming a nurse," she said simply. "Some skills transfer between careers." Dr. Chin arrived at the hospital within an hour, having been awakened by emergency calls. She found Sarah completing paperwork with law enforcement while simultaneously checking on patients who had been frightened by the night's events. The contrast was striking. The same gentle nurse who read bedtime stories was calmly describing tactical operations that had neutralized trained attackers. "Sarah, I need to understand what happened here," Dr. Chin said privately. "Your actions save lives, but they also suggest training that goes far beyond anything in your personnel file." Sarah met her supervisor's eyes directly. "I was an Army Ranger for 8 years before entering nursing school. I didn't hide my military service, but I didn't emphasize it either. I came here to heal people, not to fight." The revelation transformed how everyone viewed the quiet night nurse who had seemed almost too good at her job. Suddenly, her exceptional composure during medical emergencies, her leadership during crisis situations, and her mysterious ability to anticipate problems made perfect sense. Over the following days, as investigations revealed the full scope of Wright's planned attack, Sarah's colleagues struggled to reconcile the gentle caregiver they knew with the warrior who had protected their patients. Children who had been terrified during the lockdown began asking to hear more of Sarah's adventure stories, not knowing how real and dangerous her adventures had actually been. Hospital administration faced decisions about security procedures, staff training, and emergency protocols that had proven inadequate for the threats they'd faced. Sarah found herself consulted as an expert on security matters while simultaneously maintaining her nursing responsibilities. The most difficult conversations came with patients and families who wanted to understand what had happened. Sarah explained the events honestly, but age-appropriately, helping children process their fear while reassuring them about their safety. Parents expressed gratitude that went beyond words, recognizing that Sarah had risked her life to protect their most precious treasures. Marcus, who had worked beside Sarah for months without knowing her background, struggled with feelings of inadequacy and amazement. "I always knew you were special," he told her. "I just never imagined how special." Sarah's response reflected the humility that had made her an exceptional ranger and an exceptional nurse. "We all did our jobs that night, Marcus. You secured the building, Dr. Rodriguez coordinated communications, Janet protected patients. Everyone contributed." In the weeks that followed, Sarah received recognition from military veteran organizations, law enforcement agencies, and medical associations. Media attention was intense but brief, as Sarah refused most interview requests and let her actions speak for themselves. She had no interest in becoming a celebrity. She simply wanted to return to caring for children. The children in her care seemed to sense that something had changed, though they couldn't articulate what. Sarah remained the same gentle, competent nurse, but there was now an additional layer of security in their young minds. They knew their night nurse would protect them from anything, even monsters that were more real than the ones in their nightmares. St. Mary's Hospital implemented new security measures and emergency procedures, many based on Sarah's recommendations. She was promoted to charge nurse and asked to lead training programs for staff members. The hospital had learned that in an uncertain world, having guardians with exceptional skills could mean the difference between tragedy and safety. Sarah accepted her new responsibilities while maintaining her commitment to patient care. She continued working night shifts, continued reading bedtime stories, continued providing the gentle compassion that had drawn her to nursing. But now everyone knew that their quiet, competent colleague had once been among America's most elite warriors, and would become one again if necessary to protect the innocent. The children slept safely, watched over by someone who understood both the healing power of compassion and the protective necessity of strength. Sarah Martinez had found her calling in nursing, but she had never truly left the Rangers. She had simply found a different way to serve, a different way to protect, a different way to honor the values that had shaped her life. And if danger ever threatened her patients again, they would discover that some guardians never truly retire. They just change uniforms and continue their mission of protecting those who cannot protect themselves.